Hi guys, Grand J here and welcome to another one of our videos. Today's video will be talking about the different archetypes in the Final Fantasy TCG. This video is designed to help you get a better understanding of the sort of decks you might face and to learn a little bit about how you might be able to go about building your own decks in each of these archetypes. So the 5 types of archetypes that we'll be talking about today are aggro, combo, control, tempo, and mid-ranged. First thing before we get started is that decks don't necessarily have to fall into one of these categories. Sometimes decks have options or multiple paths to victory, and like in that sort of situation, decks can find themselves like a bit of a hybrid or find themselves with a mix of strategies. So for example, you might just find yourself playing a aggro combo type strategy or a combo control type strategy. So, what is an archetype? Archetypes are general strategies that decks are built around. They kind of help you narrow down the sort of cards that you'll play and determine what path you'll take to victory. The 3 main archetypes in the game are aggro, combo, and control, and this is just kind of like a long sort of common knowledge for TCG sort of players. There are 2 additional sort of commonly used archetypes, which are sort of more sort of playstyle focused and kind of don't fall into this, the initial 3 sort of main archetypes. And these are mid-range and tempo decks. So, looking at aggro decks first. So, aggro decks are decks that kind of focus on cheap and aggressive forwards that push damage early and usually use some sort of board wipe buff or some sort of disable as a big finisher to close out games. So the goal of every aggro deck is to reach 7 damage victory as quickly as possible. So instead of building up more of a resource base or building up bigger backups, they tend to focus on the direct path to victory by putting out cheap aggressive forwards and attacking directly. Usually this means that the deck sacrifices forward value by not playing forwards that are nearly as durable or nearly as large, but in order to do this, they're able to use the limited resources that they have in order to push these forwards to victory as soon as possible. Typically, aggro decks play very cheap, efficient threats that can deal damage early and quickly, and they usually have a much lower CP cost as a result. Generally, they use finisher cards to sort of clear a path for the final amounts of damage. So generally, aggro decks, they are using forwards that are pretty cheap and efficient so that when your opponent tries to respond against your forwards, they generally have to spend more to deal with your aggro than you are spending to put them down. This way, it allows you to sort of gain a bit of a resource advantage by pushing your forwards through for damage. So the aggro game plan is usually split up into sort of 3 phases. So first is the early uncontested damage. Because aggro decks tend to put down forwards early, all their forwards that they're putting down early before your opponent decides that they want to start contesting that damage is early uncontested damage. And this is a great way for aggro to sort of get a bit of an early advantage. By getting that early damage down, it means that when the opponent does start resisting them and start playing forwards to counter them, there's less damage for you to sort of push through at that stage. Then when your opponent starts putting their forwards down or starts contesting for board, you start using forwards or pushers to remove defensive forwards and setting up for lethal. So cards such as Genesis are ways to being able to disable your opponent's forwards, which allow your forwards that are already on the field to push through additional damage. Then, usually at this stage, when the opposing player tends to be at a higher amount of damage, playing a finisher allows you to disable your opponent's remaining forwards and to just be able to push through for the rest of your damage. So typically cards such as Bahamut and cards like Shiva are ways for you to get your forwards through. Other cards that help you get through are the Earth card Gipol, which gives all your forwards plus 4,000 power. So cards like that are able to allow your forwards to push through for extra damage and to really force a win from when you have a situation when your opponent is on high damage and they have to block all your forwards. So when building an aggro deck, your cards should fall into one of the following categories. They should be either cheap, efficient, generally unconditional forwards, so forwards that you can put down that are cheap and efficient and do their job, okay? Forwards that get through for annoying blockers, so if your opponent does start playing forwards and they start slowing you down, you need ways to be able to deal with those forwards and continue on your attack, and that's what those pushing forwards will be. Also, for any sort of forward or summon that will help you close a game when you have forwards on the field. So these are the 3 sort of categories of cards that fall into an aggro deck. So basically, cheap guys that you can play early that you don't really care about, cards that help you push through for extra damage, and big cards that you can invest the rest of your resources in to push through for lethal damage. What not to include in your aggro deck. So things not to include in your aggro decks are forwards that focus on dull abilities. So because aggro decks tend to be all about speed and all about aggression, any forward that doesn't have an immediate ability when they come into play is already a very slow card, and then any sort of ability that requires dulling your forwards basically prevents them from using their attack for that turn. So any sort of dull abilities are generally strategies or generally cards that you don't find in aggro decks. Typically, aggro decks also don't play expensive durable forwards unless they have some sort of big sort of finisher power, simply because aggro decks would much rather have multiple smaller units and push for multiple damage, and allows you to play those forwards cheaper and earlier in the game, whereas having a larger expensive forward can sometimes be in a situation where if that large forward is removed from the field, then you've kind of lost a lot of resources in one go. Additionally, forwards that require sort of complex or conditional setups are cards that you generally don't find too often in aggro decks, simply because aggro decks want to be able to curve out and ramp out their forwards as soon as possible. So if you are in a situation where you have certain cards that are required to combo or in order to play together to get that full value, these cards tend not to see you play in aggro, because aggro doesn't want to be held back by holding onto cards that generally aren't good by themselves. And also any sort of forwards that require scale or any sort of late game or any sort of long-term expenditure of resources, these are cards that generally aggro don't see play, because they don't want the game to scale, they don't want the game to sort of drag on. They want to be able to have forwards that have very strong immediate effects and to be able to pressure board as soon as possible. Next, let's look at combo decks. So combo decks are decks that focus on setting up multi-card combinations to create powerful impact and using that as a main tool for victory. Combos are combinations of cards that create a sort of a greater impact than some of their parts together. So for example, Alcid here is just a forward at 6,000 power, but if you combo him with a relevant free cost forward, you're able to deal additional damage and get 2 forwards down for a very cheap and efficient amount of cost. So it means that in these sort of situations, you're able to combine 2 cards for a very large impact. So combo decks generally create 2 sort of advantages. They either create field advantage, so this is like putting out forwards or multiple high value forwards, or removing forwards. So this controls the field, or they give you resource advantage, which help you draw, search, or discard cards. And yeah, these are commonly referred to as engine decks. So engine decks, like the word engine, means that they sort of help you build or sort of cancel out resources. So combo decks generally give you an advantage for being able to pair up certain cards by allowing you to have a great impact on the field, or to get sort of net you more resources over the game. So here are some examples of some combos. So Raoban plus Cecil. So Raoban is a 4-cost forward, 8,000 power. When Raoban enters the field, choose on forward your opponent controls, deal at 9,000 damage, and Raoban 9,000 damage. So Raoban effectively, in most cases, becomes a 4-cost summon to deal 9,000 damage, because generally Raoban's not going to survive the 9,000 damage to himself as well. So you don't really receive a forward for playing this 4-cost card. But if you combine this with the legendary card Cecil, because Cecil prevents all your other forwards from receiving any damage from summons or abilities, which include your own, while you have Cecil on the field, if you play Raoban, you're able to deal 9,000 damage to your opponent's forward, but Raoban's 9,000 damage to himself is prevented, which means that this combination actually allows you to get more value out of your Raoban, which means that your Raoban now becomes a 4-cost forward at 8,000 power that's also able to deal 9,000 damage when he comes in, which is really, really good value. He's a 4-cost forward that's able to generally destroy 5 costs or lower, and then he's also like a solid body by himself as well. So this is a good example of a combo. Another good example is Ephemeral Summoner plus Fosoya. So Ephemeral Summoner, when it comes into play, it allows you to put a Water Summoner cost 4 or less at the top of your deck. And generally the reason why we do this is in order to put an EX burst at the top of our deck. Now, Fosoya is a light backup that you can dull, choose one forward, deal at 7,000 damage. Fosoya deals you 1 point of damage. So this combos well together because Ephemeral Summoner can allow you to search for a specific summon or EX burst that you want to put at the top of your deck. And then when you use Fosoya, you're able to remove one of your opponent's forwards at 7,000 power. And also you get the EX burst of the card that you receive into damage. So this is a really good way of getting additional value. And if you get an EX burst such as a Leviathan or a Fairy or any number of cards such as Chuchulain, you're able to draw a card off that as well. So in a way, that trade-off of receiving 1 damage, now you're getting additional value out of it by generally disabling another forward or drawing yourself extra cards. And finally, another great example is Lulu plus Fosoya. So Lulu is a backup that sacrifices backups in order to deal 5,000 damage. Now, this by itself is a little bit costly, but if you combine it with Fosoya, which is a 3-cost backup that when it enters play, it deals 5,000 damage to a forward, and when Fosoya is put from the field into Break Zone, choose one forward from your Break Zone, add it to your hand. So you can play Fosoya, deal 5,000 to a forward, and then use Lulu to break that Fosoya, deal another 5,000 to it, usually breaking that forward, and then Fosoya's ability triggers off, allowing you to search your Break Zone forward and adding it to your hand. So this combo allows you to deal good damage It also allows you to search for forwards from your break zone, and yeah, it's a really good loop. And because Lulu is a sort of constant card, you can use this combo multiple times in a game. So those are some examples of combo decks. So the combo playstyle is all about assembling its combo pieces and using it to build a big resource and field advantage. Because generally when these cards combine together, they have a really strong impact. This allows the player to sort of gain a huge resource advantage to overwhelm opponents. So because they're playing cards at really strong value, your opponent is going to find it very difficult without using their own combos to sort of match the power or impact that your cards are having. The game plan for combo decks generally sort of break up into 3 phases. So first of all, in the early game, they're searching for their combo pieces while efficiently removing threats. So they want to prevent too much damage that they receive, but also they want to spend the early game sort of drawing cards or searching for cards from their deck in order to set up their combo pieces. Then, once they do have those pieces, playing those combo pieces generally will give them a lot of big effects, and this will allow them to really push the game back into their control. And after they do play down these combos, they just follow through with mid-sized, non-conditional value cards that can help push their game. So these are generally just forwards that are non-conditional. So because combo decks have cards that are conditional that need to be comboed together, you want the rest of your deck to generally be non-conditional, so they're cards that can be played without too many conditions. Otherwise, you might find your deck a little bit too situational. So generally, you want cards that don't require any sort of requirements and are just good value plays. In terms of building a combo deck, the key to focus on is one main combo interaction. So if you have 2 combos in your deck and they don't interact with each other or they don't use similar pieces, then in certain situations, you might be tossing up between which combo piece to search for or which combo piece to focus on in a specific game. And you might find yourself with combo piece A or combo piece B that are for different combos but don't work together. And you might find yourself being able to play both of them for like particularly good value. So the key is have one main combo that you want to focus on, and any sort of cards that interact well with those combo pieces are all very relevant. So that way, instead of having your entire part of the combo, if you have a combo and some other additional parts that work with it, it allows you to play those maybe for not as much value, but allows you to make decent plays without collecting older pieces. Similarly, a high amount of search or draw cards are required in these decks. Because these cards aren't necessarily great by themselves, you need to be able to find their combo pieces in order to successfully pull them off more regularly. And finally, these decks also require a decent amount of removal. So because combo decks tend to need to hold off playing cards until they sort of find their combo pieces, they need to find ways to sort of hold off damage until they get those cards. And so yeah, like these combo decks generally run a whole lot of cheap and efficient removal just to control the board until they get their combo pieces together. So things not to include in your combo decks are other cards that are for other combos, just because, like I said before, you don't want to be in situations where you're holding different cards for different combos and none of them are playable at any given time. You want your deck to focus on one combo, and that way you're able to pull it off more regularly. Additionally, any sort of cheap aggro cards that die easily or don't really sort of help push your strategy, these cards generally are cut from combo decks because they don't add to your overall strategy, and this deck doesn't really want to be pushing aggression all that early because they want to be having cards that are that will help them get to their combo. So putting resources into aggro cards that are situations where you're not putting resources into searching for your combo, and you might find yourself in a situation where your cheap aggro cards die, and you would have much rather spent the resources searching for those cards in your deck. And any sort of removal that needs scale or conditions to be effective, because combos really want to put all their eggs into their combo basket, they generally don't want any sort of other cards that take up scale or too many other resources. They want the other parts of the deck to be very efficient and to take a limited amount of resources so they can spend the majority of the resources on their combo. So you want your removal in combo decks to be really efficient and don't require scale. So anything that is too conditional are cards that you don't really want to have in your combo deck. And next, let's talk about control. So control decks are decks that focus on preventing opponents from playing their strategies by using reactive cards or renewable effects, then winning safely when their opponent can no longer threaten them. So the playstyle of a control deck is to shut down the threats that your opponent has and to build up enough resources so you won't lose. Control decks often opt for reusable or ongoing effects as opposed to those ones that are once-off effects. So generally they want to be building their resources over the game as opposed to using once-off type effects, because the control player will be able to scale the game out longer, and renewable effects will allow them to constantly be able to reuse these effects more and more times, which will allow them to build a much greater resource advantage overall throughout a longer game. So these decks tend to focus on playing cards with oppressive or ongoing effects and protecting them. These are strategies where you really want to put down an opposing card that locks down your opponent's strategy and protect them, and preventing your opponent from the longer game from being able to put their strategy online. Most of their cards will be strong reactive effects, so most of them will be ways to stop your opponent from playing their strategy, because ultimately this deck isn't so much about winning with its own strategy, but it's about not losing and not allowing your opponent to win. And then when it does get to a stage where you kind of lock the opponent into a situation where they can't win, the control deck just simply needs to put a slow amount of pressure onto the opponent, and that's how they win. So generally these decks don't need a finisher, as the control decks do prefer longer games, and as long as they got their opponent locked down into a situation where they can't win, generally the control player will have a bit of an advantage that they can just use to push through a little bit of damage here and there and eventually push through the game. So examples of control decks are discard control. So using cards such as Flan or Edward, you're able to constantly threaten your opponent's hand. And once you do, you're able to use certain cards to control the board as well, such as Sid Olstein. And by doing this, you're able to cut down your opponent's resources constantly and forcing your opponents into situations where they're unable to play their major threats. Other control examples are removal control, so using some sort of card with an ongoing removal type ability, such as Lulu, and comboing it with cards that can fuel that ability, such as Sage, such as Fasoya. These are strategies that are removal control based. And then also you've got effect control, so cards that can limit your opponent's effects, such as Emperor, Minwu, and Clearon. These all cards that lock out certain cards of the game from really getting their full effect. And if you can combine these together, you can really lock down like a large proportion of your opponent's card abilities. And at which point, if your opponent doesn't have a lot of their abilities online, then they're unable to win. And all you have to do is just constantly attack through, and your opponent isn't able to respond very effectively. So yeah, the control deck has three general phases to its game plan. So most importantly, control decks set up a resource base. They don't want to be using up their resources when they play their cards. So for them, setting up their resource base is really important. So control decks are decks that generally want to get up to 5 backups as soon as possible, because they tend to play more expensive cards and they tend to use more resources on a turn basis in order to pay for higher, more expensive renewable costs. In their second phase, they tend to play reactive forwards or reactive backup to remove threats. So playing backup based removal allows them to build backups as well as deal with forward threats at the same time. And then once all these resources pieces have come together, they will start playing down control pieces while holding enough resources to protect them and to stop threats. So control strategies have multiple ways to protect their forwards, whether it's with cards like Minwu, which are passively there, or whether with activatable abilities such as Ice's Summoner Backup, which prevents summons, or stuff like Wind's Aerith, which allows you to protect them with Planet Protector. And after you play certain forwards such as Cecil, such as the Emperor, having these control pieces open prevent your opponent from removing your control pieces, allowing you to protect them. And then the more you sort of like build up your control pieces, the more difficult it is for your opponent to respond. So when building a control deck, your card should fall into one of the following categories. So the main category to fall into is the control core effect. So whatever you want to use as your control method, cards that fall into that category are obviously the most important cards of your deck. Next are ways to protect your control. So once you do set up your control engine or your control effects, you want to be able to protect them. You want to prevent your opponent from using their card effects to break your control engine. Because as soon as they start breaking your control, you start losing control of the game, and then your opponent can start pushing again. So having ways to control your control pieces are really, really good. Additionally, any sort of removal attached to forwards or backups are really good, because they're generally quite good value, and like they help you build your resource base, or they give you an extra body to defend in combat as well. Additionally, this deck tends to play the most amount of board wipe removal, so cards like Shantoto, cards like Cloud of Darkness that can remove multiple forwards on the field and penalize players for putting a lot of forwards on the field. These decks tend to play most of those because control decks don't want to spend the early part of the game playing too many forwards, so these sort of board wipe abilities, especially symmetrical board wipe abilities, tend not to penalize the control deck all too much, so they play a lot more of these. And yeah, if there are certain cards that the control deck finds difficult to deal with, removal for specifically those problems are also cards that the control deck will play. Things not to include in your control deck. So Cheap forwards with no ongoing abilities are cards that you don't really want to put into your control deck, because you want to play cards that have a longer value for a longer part of the game, not cards that have their immediate value straight away. Those sort of cards, they have a very immediate effect, but their long game sort of value isn't that good. So the control deck doesn't really want to be investing resources into cards that don't have long-term ongoing or sort of imposing type abilities. And additionally, any sort of removal for cards that your control pieces already counter, you don't really want to have more removal for that. So you want to focus a large part of your strategy or your deck around getting your control pieces online. And so if your control piece is online, they're already going to be stopping your opponent from using certain abilities, and you don't really want to have additional removal in your deck to deal with those sort of problems, because your control strategy is already so good at dealing with them. Next are mid-range strategies. So mid-range is a deck that focuses on sequentially playing high-value cards that generally don't have much synergy, but often trades with multiple cards. So the mid-range strategy is all about sort of skipping the early game plays and playing sort of mid-range forwards that fight well and generally offer some sort of defensive ability. So these forwards, they're all about being on curve, and they're all about having slightly better sort of power than the forwards that you might see at that curve. And generally, they're quite tough to kill. So this way, it forces your opponent into spending more resources to deal with your forwards. By trading your forwards up into like higher cost forwards or against multiple smaller forwards, mid-range decks are able to gain advantage, which eventually allows them to overwhelm their opponents. So card advantage is a concept in card games where because you only draw a certain amount of cards overall during a game, any situation where you have one card trading against multiple of your opponent's cards gives you an advantage, which means you sacrifice less cards than your opponent has. And because players are limited to like 1 or 2 cards a turn, card advantage means that the more cards that you build up over the game, generally the more resources you have, and at that stage, because you have more resources, you're much more likely to win the game. And mid-range is all about playing cards that are each very difficult to deal with, and they're all like sort of like very quite strong. And because forwards that are larger are generally more difficult to deal with, your opponent will have to use multiple effects to try to deal with them at the same time. So playing multiple forwards that are like at the 8,000, 9,000 power mark, your opponent will generally have to combine either multiple forwards attacking or a forward and some sort of removal or damage ability in order to take them out. Now, if you have cards that are quite durable, then such as Warrior Light, then these forwards are able to trade against a lot of your opponent's resources, and by doing that and sequentially playing out each one of these sort of like high value threats one after the other, it will actually make it very difficult for your opponent to constantly deal with them, and eventually you just push through for advantage. So here are some example for good mid-range cards. So Capricious Reaper, so it's a 4 for 8,000 power, which is on curve, but whenever it's chosen by your opponent's abilities, it penalizes them by making them discard 1 card. Warrior Light is again a forward 4 for 8,000, but every time it receives damage, it reduces by 2,000. And Ash is free cost 7,000, so again it's a on curve forward, but whenever it's chosen by a summon or ability, your opponent Ash gains plus 3,000 power until the end of turn. So these are all cards with good defensive abilities that make it very difficult for your opponent to deal with these forwards. And because they're on curve and they're at that very good size, it's really difficult for your opponent to deal with them in combat. You want forwards that are difficult to deal with combat and difficult to deal with like cards and effects in general. That way it makes it really awkward for your opponent to deal with your forwards. And because your opponent has to use very specific outs or very specific answers to deal with your forwards, eventually they're going to start running out of answers, and that's how mid-range decks win. They kind of just barrage their opponent with sort of good value forwards that are hard to deal with until your opponent runs out of answers. So, some notes for mid-range decks. So many TCG purists, especially from other card games, they don't consider mid-range a true archetype. This is because it doesn't really have a set game plan. It usually doesn't really have a finisher, and it's not really setting up towards any sort of overall game plan. It's generally just basically a play style. You just kind of put down forwards again and again and again, and then your opponent just like, you hope your opponent just kind of runs out of answers to deal with your forwards. That being said though, it's not a bad strategy, and don't discount its effectiveness. There are certain decks that are mid-range, so they don't necessarily have a finisher or they don't have a sort of bigger game plan. But sometimes if those cards just offer too much value, mid-range decks can be very strong. So the mid-range weaknesses are, so the first of all, like the trade-off with mid-range decks is that they generally lack pushing power or surprise kill threat. So cards such as Warrior Light, cards such as Capricious Reaper, these cards, they generally don't have particularly strong abilities, aggressive abilities, so they're not able to push through when you do have an advantage. Generally, it's a much slower slower path to victory because your opponent is able to put up token defense or like put up token resistance against your forwards. Even though you are building resource advantages, you can only generally win once your opponent starts running out of resources to deal with your forwards. So it lacks the pushing power or surprise kill threat. So if you do find yourself where you are at a big resource advantage, you aren't able to really push any faster because your deck doesn't have any ability to do so. The only thing you can really do is just apply more forwards down, which can be punished in this game by using board wipe ability. So mid-range decks have that weakness where they can't push for lethal kill threat when they do have an advantage because the deck isn't equipped for doing that. And as a result, yeah, it does mean that mid-range decks tend to be very weak against board wipe type effects that are able to sort of really quickly wipe the advantage that mid-range decks build by having a much stronger board. So finally, let's talk about tempo decks. So tempo decks are decks that focus on playing cost-effective threats and high-impact cards that opponents find difficult to match at the same pace. So the idea of tempo decks is that you're kind of racing your opponent, but compared to aggro decks, you aren't necessarily putting down cards that are purely aggro or purely speed. Tempo is about getting good value for your CP. So the playstyle for tempo decks is that instead of playing just purely aggressive cards, tempo decks play cards and combos that have good cost impact ratios. They invest a little bit more into the cost of cards, but they get a much stronger field and board presence by doing so. So the importance of tempo decks is that you want to get extra value for your CP, whereas aggro decks, they tend to want to just like put down cheap and efficient forwards that will attack very well. And if your opponent uses removal abilities, because your forwards are generally very cheap and efficient, the removal is going to be more expensive or less cost effective than playing those forwards. Tempo decks, however, kind of push it more towards the efficiency route. By playing cards that have like really strong abilities, even though they might be a little bit conditional, they're able to get a lot more value out of their cards. So by playing cards of high impact, tempo decks are able to get more value out of their CP. So for example, the free cost legendary Vivi, while it doesn't have really any sort of aggressive play in that it doesn't help you push for damage or it doesn't really speed through, at free cost you are getting a body, and at the same time you're usually able to deal somewhere between 6,000 to 8,000 damage. So by using free CP, you are getting like a 3,000, like a free cost nuke or a 4-cost nuke even attached to a body as well. So you're getting a lot of value for your free CP. And when you see a lot of like high level players evaluate cards in terms of like, is this card good enough for 4 CP or is this card good enough for 3 CP? Any situation where a card has a lot of like value or a lot of impact or does a lot at its cost, these are high tempo plays because these are situations where you can pay a small cost, but it gives you a lot of value for it. And that's what tempo is all about. It's about getting a lot of value for the CP that you pay. And yeah, it's about creating like bodies that are higher than their usual cost or being able to deal with more threats more cheaply than their opponent. So it's all about cost. It doesn't necessarily have to be all about playing cheap cards. Tempo does play a whole like variety of costed cards as long as they have a good impact and as long as they bring a lot of value to the table. So by spending more CP and using it more effectively than your opponent, you're able to get a lot more value out of it. And if you are ramping up your resources at a similar rate than your opponent, you're able to gain a CP advantage of your opponent. And then at this stage, if your opponent wants to match you, they have to expend more resources for them to match you. And in doing so, you sort of gain a resource advantage by doing that. So if your opponent is forced to match cards, whereas like certain cards, you might get like 8 CP worth of value, your opponent might find that it costs them 10 or 12 CP in order to match that. Because they have to spend those extra resources to try to match you or to try to slow you down, your opponent has to discard extra cards, and by doing so, you gain additional advantage there. So tempo is about getting good value and forcing your opponent to play faster than their deck is used to and forces them to discard more cards. So a good example here is the 6-cost Ace. So you are spending 6 costs, so it's a cost that's a little bit more difficult for aggro decks to pay off, but effectively you're getting a 7,000 power body and allows you to play another Ace Cadet from your hand. So if you combine it with something like King, or if you combine it with 9, you're getting a 5-cost or 4-cost forward that's on curve. And additionally, when Ace dies, he gets you a Class 0 Cadet from your break zone added to your hand. So ace has a lot of value. Here's a tempo card. You play it down, you get another strong forward, so you're already getting good value there. And then when ace dies, you get an additional card. So he brings a lot of value to the table, and he's a high tempo player. And so often when Class 0 cadet decks do place ace, opponents might find it very difficult, at least like immediately, to respond to two big forwards, and they don't really want to deal with the ace because then like they get cards back to their hand. So it's a lot of value, and this is what tempo decks are about. They play big combination of cards, which make it really difficult for your opponent to counter with their decks, especially if their decks aren't built in a way to get big bursts of value. So here are some examples of tempo cards. So Lena and Knight. So Lena, when it comes into play, allows you to get a 2-cost water forward from your break zone and put it back onto the field. Now this combos with the 2-cost Knight really well. If you happen to have 5 backups, then you're able to put Lena down, which is a 5-cost 7,000 power, and Knight is a 2-cost 8,000 power. So for 5 CP, you're able to get 7,000 power forward and an 8,000 power forward. So that's a lot of value for 5 CP. Alcid doesn't really need much explaining. For 4 CP, you're getting a 6,000 damage nuke, and 2 forwards generally around the 6,000 power mark. And if this is combined with a card like Onion Knight, then it's able to kill an opposing forward, which generally is valued at 4 CP by itself, and puts 2 forwards down. Another high tempo play is Yang and Ursula. So when you have Yang and you play them down, you can put an Ursula down from your hand, and while you have both of them on the field, they both become 9,000 power forwards. So for 4 CP, you're able to get 2 9,000 power forwards, and this is a reason why a lot of players find Earth decks, especially during Opus 3, very difficult to deal with, because on turn 1 they can discard 2 cards and get 2 very high powered forwards at 9,000 power straight away, because it's a high tempo play, and because certain decks aren't able to match that tempo, they're playing from behind. They have to discard a lot of cards to either match that deck's aggression, or they have to start building their backups much faster to give them the resources to deal with these 2 9,000 power forwards. And that's what tempo is about. It's about making your opponent find it very difficult to respond to the speed in which you're playing your cards. And finally, Barbarisha. It's a 4 CP forward at 7,000 power, so it's a little bit below curve in this case, but it does force a forward to become 1,000 power. So in a lot of cases, if this does combo with another card, this allows you to kill an opponent's forward and get a pretty good value forward at the same time. So it's a really strong ability, and attached to a pretty solid body. It's a high tempo, so high value play. Tempo is all about what effect your cards are putting onto the field or on the board for their cost. So again, a lot of TCG purists don't consider this a true archetype, because again, it's not really a game plan as opposed to more of a play style. Tempo is often sort of considered like a hybrid between aggro combo or aggro control, depending on sort of like what it sort of leans on to use to gain its extra tempo. But generally, because it is a deck that's a little bit more about speed or efficiency, it tends to be more aggressive, because it kind of wants to get that additional value onto the field and wants to force your opponents to sort of try to match that. And that's why it does tend to be a more of a quicker or more aggro sort of deck. If mid-range is more about getting more value for your cards, then tempo is about getting more value for your CP and trading against your opponent's CP. And that's what the sort of big difference between mid-range and tempo is that one is like a card for card trade, and because your cards are have a much bigger body than their cards, your cards are able to like match them 1 for 2, and tempo is all about getting more advantage for your CP. So for you spending 4 CP, you're able to get 2 9,000 power forwards, whereas your opponent, if they spend 4 CP, they might only be able to get 1 8,000 power forward. And in order to do this, and in order to match your aggression, your opponent might have to spend 5 CP to get 9,000 power forward, or your opponent might have to spend 8 CP to get 2 8,000 power forwards, and so on. So yeah, it's all about being able to get that CP advantage, and forcing your opponent to spend additional CP in order to match your deck's value. The weakness to tempo decks, however, is that as a result, tempo decks tend to be more situational. So a lot of those cards that are tempo cards, they generally require you to hold certain combo pieces, or they require the board to be in a certain way. Generally, they can't be played by themselves. They generally only get like a lot more value when you have your tempo plays together. And as a result, if your opponent can predict what your tempo plays are, they can counter them. So for example, Alcid's a really high tempo play, but if your opponent has certain tools such as Red Mage, keeping their forwards hasted will keep them dull, and because their forwards are dull, it never gives the opponent an opportunity to use Alcid. So as a result, tempo decks can seem a bit like glass cannons in that they are really strong and they are pretty fast, but if your opponent has the right strategy or has a certain counter, then it can cause the tempo decks to sort of fall apart very, very quickly. And that's sort of the pros and cons to this strategy. So we've talked about the different archetypes in this game, but what's the point? So when building a deck, after you've decided on the core that you sort of want to build your deck around, defining a strategy will help you determine your game plan and how you want to go about winning, and then help you build the rest of your deck. Now, if you checked out my earlier deck building video, you'll understand that we talked about some stuff like the core and the focus and how to build your game plan from there, right? Now, determining what archetype your core is about will help you determine what sort of cards are good support for your deck and what direction you want to take the rest of your deck. So for example, let's say you picked up the new Dissidia game and you got one of the cool new Dissidia promos. So let's say you got this Cloud. It's a 4-cost light forward at 8,000 power. It's got Brave and it's got 2 special abilities, Meteor Rain and Omni Slash, right? And you want to build a deck around it because you're really excited to use this card in the game, right? So what sort of strategy does it fit? You have to consider, is it good for aggro, combo, control, mid-range, and tempo? And after you sort of decide which sort of categories it fits into, then you can build a relevant strategy. So let's have a look. Is this it's not a very cheap or fast card, so it doesn't have an immediate ability, and it doesn't attack immediately, and it doesn't have like a ability when it comes into play, so it doesn't really fit into the aggro strategy. There are some synergies. Actually, there's a lot of synergies with Cloud with a lot of cards, especially a lot of cards that are called Zac, usually sort of synergize with Cloud, so it does lend itself for potentially a combo deck. At the same time, its S ability, Omni Slash, is a renewable removal ability, so it does lend itself for a control deck type strategy. The body itself doesn't really offer enough value and is a little bit conditional in that you do require additional cards in your hand to use its S ability, so it doesn't really sort of lend itself more to a mid-range strategy in that the body by itself isn't kind of good enough value, and its effect is kind of lackluster for just a body by itself. But with certain cards that support it, this card can be played early, and its effect offers pretty good tempo value in that it's able to remove your opponent's forward. So it has a pretty good cost to value ratio, so it does lend itself to potentially a tempo strategy. So if we look at a combo deck, cards such as Zac to support this card by helping getting him to play cheaper, helping getting him to play more often, and to fuel his S ability. Zac is a good direction to go if you want to sort of build it into a combo deck. If you want to play him as a control card, you can use protection effects such as Aerith to keep him alive and to protect him onto the field, so you can use this effect more often. And then you can use additional abilities such as Ashura to recycle additional copies of Cloud back into your hand to use this effect more often. And this is a sort of these are the cards that you would include if you want to take this Cloud into more of a control deck fashion. And if you were to try to build it as a sort of tempo deck, cards like Jesse can allow you to get him into play for cheaper, which means that your opponent has to discard more cards to deal with him at an earlier stage of the game. Because your Omni Slash removes their forward, if your opponent discards extra cards to get forwards to contest the board, and if they're discarding extra cards to get them down earlier, it means that your Omni Slash actually gets more value because your opponent's discarded extra cards to get those forwards down. So so this is Jesse would potentially be a card that you put into if you want to take Cloud into more of a tempo-based deck. So these are just really good examples for depending on how you want to take the strategy of your deck and what cards are available, you can take them into different directions, and subsequently you can add additional cards that sort of build onto that specific strategy. So in summary, understanding archetypes can help you determine how to build your deck. And if you can identify archetypes, it can help you determine what your opponent's game plans are and help you predict their cards as well. So if they are an aggressive strategy, you can have a pretty good feeling that they'll have some sort of finisher card to push through, such as Shiva or such as Bahamut or something like that, or Gipol. And if your opponent's playing control, you can generally understand that they'll probably have certain cards in their color, such as Minwu or such as Lulu and so on. So having a good knowledge of archetypes and being able to figure out your opponent's archetype can help you determine how the deck is built and allow you to play against their cards in the right way. And ultimately, it helps you to build a path to victory as well during games. So if you can understand whether your deck is a tempo deck or a mid-range deck or a control deck or whatever, you can determine whether it's more important to hold cards now to contest the board, or whether it's more important to search for cards in your deck, or whether it's more important for you to push for extra damage now, even though you're causing trades. So when you know how you're supposed to win the game, then you're really able to sort of make a lot of better, more optimal game plan decisions towards the mid game that can help you build up to where you want to be in the end game. If you guys watch my stream, you will notice me saying something pretty often, and that's called playing to your outs. And what that means is figuring out how can you set your deck up in a way that you can draw potentially the right cards from your deck to set up your win in future turns. And a good way to know this is to understand your path to victory. So if you know how where you want to end up, then you can sort of build a path towards there. And yeah, that's what knowing your archetype, and especially really defining your deck, can really help you have a good understanding of. So, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Today's video was a little bit more academic and a little bit more theoretical. Do let me know if you enjoy these sort of videos, or whether you want me to go back more to deck video type stuff. Yeah, let me know your thoughts and feedbacks or your comments. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to put them in the comments. I do respond to most of you guys. Yeah, if you guys enjoyed the video, please thumbs up and subscribe. It helps out with all the YouTube analytics and algorithms and all that sort of stuff. Also, I do stream this game on a pretty regular basis. Yeah, the times are down below, so if you do want to check that out, go to my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/grandjason, where we play these games online live. And also, if you have any sort of questions, or if you have any sort of decks you want help with, then that's a live time in which we can work on that as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and got a lot out of it. And for now, Grand J out.